Hi, in this video we'll talk about how to have the computer repeat the same set of instructions multiple times by using what's called loops. Let's get started. Say you want to write a program that prints hello 5 times for whatever reason. How do you do that? The most obvious solution is to call the printf function with the same text, hello, 5 times, like this. Seems doable, just a bit of copy pasting. But what if you want to write a program that will drive the user absolutely crazy by printing the word hello 100 times? Copy pasting is still doable, but way more annoying. Fortunately, unlike humans, computers are very good at repeatedly performing the same action a huge number of times. And to make them do that, we can use what's called a loop. There are several types of loops, and the first one we're going to use is the for loop. On the screen, you can see a typical for loop. A for loop header consists of 3 parts. The first part is called counter initialization. In our case, the int variable I is called counter because its main function is to count how many times the computer has performed the action inside a loop. Traditionally, the letter I is used as counter name. The second part is called loop termination condition. The computer uses it to figure out whether it needs to continue repeating the set of instructions inside the loop or not. The third part is called counter increment. Every time the instructions inside the loop get executed, you need to update the value of the counter variable. The double plus sign means that when the computer finishes executing all the instructions inside the loop, it must increase the counter by 1. Finally, as you have probably figured, the instructions you want the computer to execute inside the loop must go inside the pair of curly brackets that follow the loop header. Let me give you an example of a for loop. This piece of code will tell the computer, set the value of the variable I to 0. Check whether the value of the variable I is smaller than 5, and if it is, print hello. Increase the value of the variable I by 1. Check whether the value of the variable I is still smaller than 5, and if it is, print hello again. And again, while the value of the variable I is smaller than 5. How many times do you think the computer will print hello? Let's see if you're right. The value of the variable I starts at 0. 0 is smaller than 5, so hello gets printed. And the computer will keep printing hello until the value of the variable I reaches 5, because 5 is not smaller than 5. In other words, the word hello will be printed 5 times. Let's actually write this program and run it in Replit. The word hello indeed gets printed 5 times. If you change this 5 to, say, 10, hello will be printed 10 times. And if you change it to 100, it will be printed 100 times. However, what do you think will happen if I change it to 0? Since 0 is not smaller than 0, hello will not be printed. In other words, depending on the loop termination condition, the computer might completely ignore the instructions inside the loop. Now, what do you think will happen if I change this condition to, say, I is greater than -1? How many times do you think the word hello will be printed? Since I will always be greater than -1, hello can potentially be printed an infinite number of times. Loops like this one are called infinite loops because their termination conditions cannot possibly be met, ever. While it doesn't seem like a huge issue in Replit, you can just stop the program. Infinite loops might cause your computer to freeze because it will be too busy trying to execute the instructions inside an infinite loop, so it won't have any spare time to do anything else. What else can we do inside a loop? We can increase a number by another number several times, like this. What this program does is it adds 2 to the variable a 10 times and then prints the result of addition. This part might be a little confusing, especially if you view it as a mathematical equation. In programming, however, this means that the computer must get the value stored in the variable a, increase it by 2, and store the result in the variable a, overriding the old value of the variable a. In other words, the new value stored in the variable a is the old value stored in the variable a increased by 2. Now let's look at the variable I that we use as a counter. The variable I can be used inside the loop just like any other variable. Let's print the value of the variable I inside the loop. The program prints numbers from 0 to 9. Note that the variable I is not visible outside the loop, so if you try to print its value or do anything else outside the curly brackets, Replit will throw an error. In other words, variables declared in a loop are only visible inside that loop. How do we use the variable I to our advantage? One of the most common usages of a loop counter is traversing arrays. Before we actually do that, we need to figure out what an array is and what traversing means. We've already used arrays, specifically arrays of characters, but we refer to an array of characters as a bunch of characters. Some of you have probably figured that I'm talking about strings. So strings are effectively arrays of the type char, and in addition to strings, we can have arrays of any other data type. In other words, an array is a collection of variables of the same data type. Let's look at an example of an array of the type int. We have just declared an array of the type int, named it int_array, and set its size to 10 elements. Looks very similar to how we declare string variables. What we're going to do now is we're going to create a simple program that traverses the array int_array and prints the value of each of the elements stored in that array. Traversing an array basically means looping through an array, accessing the values stored in the array, and doing something with those values. To traverse the array int_array, we're going to use a for loop. Some of you might remember how we printed individual characters of a string by specifying the index of the character we wanted to print. This works the same for any other array of any other type. So to print a number stored in the array int_array, we need to specify its index, and here's where the counter shines. We can use it as the index of the element we want to print, and since the value of the counter increases every time the computer executes the instructions inside the loop, this loop will print every single number stored in our array. Some of you might have noticed that we haven't assigned any value to any number stored in int_array. Let's do that now. We can do that assigning values to individual elements like this, or we can assign values to all the elements at once. To do so, we need to specify those values inside a pair of curly brackets, like this. Now, if we run the program, it will print the values stored in the array. Instead of simply printing the numbers stored in the array, let's have a program add them all up and print the result. To do so, we need a variable to store the sum of the numbers. Where in code do we declare it? Since we want the program to display the sum of all the numbers stored in the array, we need to print it below the loop after the computer is done adding them. In other words, the variable we will use to store the result of addition must be visible both inside and outside the loop. Since variables declared inside the loop, like the counter I, are only visible inside the loop, the variable that will store the result of addition must be declared outside and above the loop. Let's now declare an int variable and name it sum. Now, inside the loop, we're going to increase the sum by the value stored in the array at the index specified by the value of the counter. And finally, we need to tell the computer to display the sum. If we run the program now, it will print 55, which is the sum of the numbers 1 through 10. What did we learn in this video? We'll learn that to make the computer repeat the same set of instructions multiple times, we can use a loop. There are several types of loops, and in this video, we'll learn how to use the for loop. We also learned that a string is a collection of variables of the type char, also known as an array of the type char. In addition, we can have arrays of types other than char, for example, int. Going through elements of an array and doing something with them is called traversing an array, and we can use the for loop to traverse arrays. This is it for this video. In the next one, we'll talk about another type of loop, the while loop. See you then. Bye.